The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured grounds of Rideau Hall as staff members rushed about with final preparations. Canada's Governor-General residence had seen many distinguished visitors over the years, but today carried special significance. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau adjusted his tie one final time as he reviewed the carefully planned itinerary with his chief of staff. Everything needs to be perfect, Trudeau emphasized, his voice carrying the weight of diplomatic importance. This visit could strengthen our ties with the Commonwealth for years to come. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, 10-year-old Prince George sat quietly in the back seat of the royal convoy as it made its way through London traffic toward Heathrow Airport. His younger siblings, Princess Charlotte and Prince Louis, chattered excitedly about their upcoming trip to Canada, but George remained unusually subdued. His governess, Maria Theresa, noticed his contemplative mood. "Are you feeling all right, Your Royal Highness?" she asked gently. George nodded, but continued staring out the window. The truth was he had been doing his homework about Canada and its prime minister. Unlike his siblings, who were simply excited about seeing moose and maple syrup farms, George had been reading news articles and watching videos about recent political developments. His parents had always encouraged him to understand the world around him, perhaps not anticipating how seriously their eldest son would take this responsibility. At 12 years old, George possessed an unusual maturity for his age. Palace tutors often remarked on his ability to grasp complex subjects and his genuine interest in current affairs. He had spent the previous evening reading about Canada's environmental policies, Indigenous rights issues, and various political controversies that had made international headlines. The flight to Ottawa was long, giving George plenty of time to think. While his siblings played games and watched movies, he continued reading briefing materials that his father, Prince William, had shared with him. These weren't the usual simplified explanations given to children, but real documents discussing trade relationships, environmental concerns, and diplomatic protocols. George seems very serious about this trip, Princess Catherine observed to her husband as they watched their son studying intently. Prince William smiled proudly, but with a hint of concern. He's been asking very detailed questions about Canadian politics. I'm not sure what's going through his mind. What was going through George's mind was a growing sense of unease about certain policies and statements he had encountered in his research. The young prince had developed strong feelings about environmental protection, partly influenced by his grandfather King Charles's long-standing passion for conservation. He had also been deeply moved by stories about Indigenous communities and their historical struggles. As the plane began its descent into Ottawa, George made a decision that would surprise everyone involved in the carefully orchestrated visit. He would not simply smile and wave through the diplomatic pleasantries. Instead, he would use this opportunity to express his genuine concerns about issues that mattered to him. The Canadian Welcoming Committee had assembled at the airport with military precision. Red carpets were rolled out, honor guards stood at attention, and media representatives positioned themselves for the perfect shots. Prime Minister Trudeau waited with his characteristic confident smile, having spent considerable time preparing for this moment. When the royal family emerged from the aircraft, the crowd erupted in cheers. Princess Charlotte waved enthusiastically. Prince Louis looked slightly overwhelmed by the attention, and Prince George walked with dignified composure beside his parents. But those who knew him well might have noticed something different in his expression, a determined look that suggested he had something important on his mind. The official greeting ceremony proceeded according to protocol. Trudeau stepped forward with genuine warmth, extending his hand first to Prince William and Princess Catherine before turning to the children. "Welcome to Canada, Your Royal Highnesses. We're absolutely delighted to have you here." When Trudeau reached George, extending his hand with a practiced political smile, something unexpected happened. The young prince looked directly into the Prime Minister's eyes for a moment that seemed longer than protocol would suggest, then simply nodded politely without extending his own hand. The gesture was subtle enough that many observers missed it entirely, but those paying close attention noticed the slight awkwardness. Trudeau, experienced in handling unexpected moments during public appearances, smoothly continued the greeting line without missing a beat. However, he couldn't help but wonder about the young prince's reserved response. Children usually responded to his warm demeanor with enthusiasm. As the royal family was escorted to their waiting vehicles, George walked slightly apart from the group, his mind clearly elsewhere. The first seeds of what would become a diplomatic incident had been planted, though none of the adults present could have predicted the significant events that would unfold over the coming days. The convoy made its way through Ottawa streets lined with excited Canadian citizens waving flags and holding welcome signs. While his siblings pressed against the windows, waving back at the crowds, George remained seated upright, observing everything with an analytical eye that seemed far beyond his years. That evening, as the royal family settled into their accommodations, Prince William approached his eldest son. "George, is everything all right? You seemed a bit distant during the arrival ceremony." George looked up from the book he was reading about Canadian history. "Father, I've been learning about some concerning things. I think we need to discuss them before tomorrow's events." Prince William sat down beside his son, recognizing the serious tone that had become increasingly familiar. Whatever was troubling George clearly ran deeper than typical childhood concerns, and the Prince of Wales realized that their Canadian visit might prove more eventful than anyone had anticipated. The next morning brought crisp autumn air and golden sunlight filtering through the windows of Rideau Hall. Prince George woke early, as was his custom, and immediately reached for his tablet to read the latest news from around the world. His siblings were still sleeping peacefully, but George's mind was already active, processing information and forming opinions about the day ahead. Princess Catherine found him in the sitting area, fully dressed, and reviewing notes he had written in his careful handwriting. "You're up early, darling. The official breakfast isn't for another hour." "I wanted to prepare myself properly," George replied, looking up from his papers. "Mother, do you think it's appropriate for me to ask difficult questions during today's meetings?" Catherine sat beside her son, recognizing the weight behind his question. "What kind of questions are you thinking about?" George showed her his notes, filled with references to environmental policies, indigenous rights, and recent political decisions that had drawn international criticism. His research was thorough and his concerns genuine, but Catherine realized her son was grappling with complex issues that even seasoned diplomats found challenging. "These are very important topics, George," she said carefully. "But remember, this visit is about building positive relationships. Sometimes the most effective conversations happen privately rather than in formal settings." Meanwhile, Prime Minister Trudeau was having his own morning briefing with his senior staff. The day's schedule was packed with carefully planned activities designed to showcase Canada's best qualities while strengthening ties with the royal family. Everything had been choreographed to ensure positive media coverage and successful diplomatic outcomes. "The breakfast meeting should be straightforward," his chief of staff explained. "Light conversation, some discussion about Canadian culture and traditions, photo opportunities with the children. The prince and princess are known for being very personable and easy to work with." Trudeau nodded, though he couldn't shake the memory of young Prince George's reserved greeting the previous day. Something about the boy's demeanor suggested there was more depth there than typical for someone his age. Still, he was just a child, and surely any interaction would be pleasant and uncomplicated. The formal breakfast was held in Rideau Hall's elegant dining room, with its crystal chandeliers and portraits of previous governor-generals watching over the proceedings. Canadian officials had arranged a menu featuring local specialties, hoping to give the royal family an authentic taste of Canadian cuisine. Princess Charlotte and Prince Louis were immediately charmed by the maple syrup and asked numerous questions about how it was made. Their enthusiasm delighted everyone present, creating exactly the warm atmosphere the organizers had hoped for. Prince William and Princess Catherine engaged in easy conversation with Trudeau about their previous visits to Canada and their admiration for the country's natural beauty. But Prince George remained notably quiet throughout the meal, eating politely while listening intently to every word. Several times, adults at the table attempted to draw him into the conversation with questions about his interests or school subjects, but his responses were brief and formal. Prince George, I understand you're quite interested in environmental conservation, Trudeau said, hoping to connect with the young prince on a topic that seemed important to him. Canada has some remarkable wilderness areas that we're working hard to protect. George looked up from his plate, meeting Trudeau's eyes with a directness that was somewhat startling. Yes, I've read about your environmental policies, he replied evenly. Some of them are quite interesting. The way he said interesting carried a subtle undertone that made several adults at the table exchange glances. There was something in the young prince's tone that suggested his opinion might not be entirely positive. Trudeau, sensing an opportunity to engage further, began describing Canada's recent environmental initiatives. He spoke enthusiastically about carbon reduction goals, renewable energy projects, and conservation efforts, clearly hoping to impress the environmentally conscious royal family. George listened politely, but as Trudeau continued, the young prince's expression remained neutral. When the Prime Minister finished his explanation, George simply nodded and said, "Thank you for sharing that information." The conversation moved on to other topics, but those paying attention noticed that George had effectively ended the environmental discussion without offering any positive response or follow-up questions. For a child who was clearly interested in the subject, his lack of enthusiasm was puzzling. After breakfast, the day's official activities began with a tour of the Parliament buildings. This was meant to be an educational experience for the royal children, with explanations about Canadian democracy and history. Prince Louis was fascinated by the Gothic Revival architecture, while Princess Charlotte asked numerous questions about how laws were made. Prince George walked through the halls with apparent interest, but his questions were notably different from his siblings. While they asked about the building's history and decorative elements, George inquired about specific recent legislation, voting procedures, and the relationship between federal and provincial governments. "You seem to know quite a bit about our political system already," observed the parliamentary guide, impressed by George's sophisticated questions. "I believe it's important to understand how decisions are made that affect people's lives," George replied matter-of-factly. During the visit to the Senate chamber, Trudeau took the opportunity to explain the legislative process in more detail. He spoke about the importance of debate, compromise, and finding solutions that work for all Canadians. Throughout his explanation, George listened carefully but offered no comments or questions. The tour continued to the House of Commons, where Trudeau described the role of opposition parties and the importance of holding government accountable. In a democracy, he explained, it's crucial that different voices can be heard and that leaders are questioned about their decisions. George's response to this statement would later be remembered as a pivotal moment. Looking directly at Trudeau, the young prince said quietly, "That's very true, Prime Minister. Accountability is indeed important." The words themselves were appropriate and even praiseworthy, but something in George's delivery suggested deeper meaning. It wasn't the response of a child simply agreeing with an adult's explanation, but rather seemed to carry an underlying message that made several observers uncomfortable. As the parliamentary tour concluded, Trudeau found himself increasingly intrigued by Prince George's behavior. The boy was clearly intelligent and well-informed, but there was something in his demeanor that suggested disapproval or disappointment. For someone accustomed to winning over audiences with his charisma, Trudeau was facing an unusual challenge in connecting with this particular young person. The afternoon brought a visit to a local Indigenous cultural center, an event that had been planned to highlight Canada's commitment to reconciliation and cultural understanding. This stop would prove to be even more significant than anyone had anticipated, as Prince George's true feelings about certain issues were about to become much more apparent. The Indigenous Cultural Centre stood as a modern testament to Canada's First Nations heritage, its sweeping architecture incorporating traditional design elements with contemporary materials. As the royal convoy approached, hundreds of community members had gathered outside, many wearing traditional regalia and carrying drums that created a rhythmic welcome. Elder Mary Sinclair, a respected leader from the local Algonquin Nation, waited at the entrance alongside Trudeau and other officials. She had been chosen to lead the cultural presentation, and her weathered face carried both pride and a hint of wariness about the political implications of the visit. Prince George stepped out of the vehicle and immediately noticed the intricate beadwork on Elder Sinclair's traditional dress, the careful craftsmanship of the ceremonial items on display, and the dignified bearing of the indigenous representatives. Unlike his earlier reserved behavior, he seemed genuinely moved by the cultural richness surrounding him. "Welcome to our traditional territory," Elder Sinclair said, addressing the royal family with formal ceremony. "We are honored by your presence here today." Prince William responded appropriately, expressing gratitude for the invitation and respect for indigenous culture. Princess Charlotte and Prince Louis were visibly amazed by the colorful displays and the sound of traditional drums. But Prince George's reaction was notably different. He appeared to be absorbing every detail with intense focus, as if memorizing the experience. The cultural presentation began with traditional songs and dances performed by youth from local indigenous communities. The young performers moved with practiced grace, their regalia shimmering in the afternoon light. Trudeau provided commentary, explaining the significance of various elements and describing his government's efforts to support indigenous culture and rights. "We've made significant investments in indigenous education and cultural preservation," Trudeau explained to the royal family. "It's important that these traditions continue for future generations." Prince George listened to this explanation while watching the young dancers, who appeared to be roughly his own age. Something in their expressions and the solemnity of their performance seemed to affect him deeply. When the dancing concluded and applause filled the space, George clapped respectfully, but with a thoughtful expression that suggested his mind was elsewhere. The group moved inside for a tour of the cultural exhibits, which showcased traditional artifacts, historical displays, and contemporary indigenous art. Elder Sinclair served as their guide, sharing stories about each item and explaining their cultural significance. Her narration was rich with detail about traditional ways of life, spiritual beliefs, and the deep connection between indigenous peoples and the land. Trudeau supplemented Elder Sinclair's explanations with information about current government programs and initiatives. He spoke about land acknowledgements, funding for indigenous communities, and efforts to address historical injustices. His tone was earnest, and his commitment seemed genuine, but Prince George continued to listen without offering any positive response. When they reached a display about residential schools and their impact on indigenous communities, the atmosphere in the room became more somber. Elder Sinclair spoke quietly about the experiences of family members who had attended these institutions and the ongoing effects on indigenous communities. Her words were carefully chosen, but carried emotional weight that was impossible to ignore. "This is a difficult part of our history," Trudeau acknowledged, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "Our government has committed to truth and reconciliation, and we're working to ensure that these injustices are never repeated." Prince George had been studying this topic extensively in his research, and for the first time during the visit, he spoke up with a direct question. "Elder Sinclair, how do you feel about the progress that has been made toward reconciliation?" The question surprised everyone present. It wasn't the type of inquiry typically expected from a child, and it put Elder Sinclair in the position of having to give an honest assessment while standing next to the Prime Minister who had been promoting his government's efforts. Elder Sinclair looked at Prince George with new respect, recognizing that his question came from genuine concern rather than polite curiosity. "Young Prince," she said thoughtfully, "reconciliation is a long journey. There have been some positive steps, but there is still much work to be done. Actions matter more than words." The weight of her response hung in the air. Prince George nodded seriously, as if her answer confirmed something he had already been thinking. Trudeau shifted slightly, sensing that the conversation was moving in an unexpected direction. "We're committed to taking concrete actions," Trudeau interjected, "not just making promises." Our government has allocated significant resources to address Indigenous priorities. Prince George turned to look at Trudeau, and for a moment, the young prince's composure seemed to waver. Resource allocation is important, he said quietly, but I've read that many communities still lack access to clean drinking water. How do you explain that disconnect? The question landed with startling impact. Here was a 10-year-old prince challenging a sitting prime minister about one of Canada's most persistent and embarrassing policy failures. The adults in the room were stunned by both the sophistication of the question and the boldness of a child posing it directly to a world leader. Trudeau, caught off guard, began to explain the complexities of infrastructure development in remote communities, the challenges of coordinating between different levels of government, and the technical difficulties involved in water system improvements. His response was detailed and defensive, clearly attempting to justify his government's record. But as Trudeau spoke, Prince George's expression remained skeptical. When the Prime Minister finished his explanation, the young prince simply said, "I see. Thank you for clarifying that." Once again, George's response was technically polite, but carried an undertone that suggested he found the explanation unsatisfactory. Elder Sinclair watched this exchange with interest, clearly impressed by the young prince's knowledge and courage in raising difficult questions. The tour continued, but the dynamic in the group had shifted. Prince George's pointed question had created an undercurrent of tension that affected everyone present. Trudeau found himself being more careful with his statements, aware that this unusually informed child might challenge anything that seemed like political rhetoric. When they reached a display about environmental protection and Indigenous land rights, Prince George asked another unexpected question. "Elder Sinclair, how do major development projects affect traditional territories and the communities that depend on them?" This question touched on another sensitive political issue, as Trudeau's government had approved several controversial pipeline and mining projects despite Indigenous opposition. Elder Sinclair's response was diplomatic but pointed, acknowledging the economic importance of development while emphasizing the need to respect Indigenous rights and environmental concerns. Trudeau attempted to frame his government's approach as balancing economic needs with environmental protection and Indigenous rights. But Prince George's next comment stopped him short. "I've read that several Indigenous communities have had to go to court to protect their traditional territories for development projects," George said evenly. "That suggests the consultation process might not be working as effectively as intended." The statement was delivered with the same quiet, matter-of-fact tone that George had maintained throughout the visit, but its implications were significant. He was essentially suggesting that Trudeau's government was failing in its duty to Indigenous peoples, and he was doing so based on his own research and analysis. As the Cultural Center visit concluded, it was clear that something unprecedented had occurred. A young member of the royal family had publicly questioned a head of government's policies, and done so with sufficient knowledge and sophistication to make his challenges meaningful. The implications of this development were only beginning to be understood by those present, but the effects would soon extend far beyond the walls of the Cultural Center. The evening reception at Rideau Hall was intended to be the social highlight of the royal visit, bringing together Canadian dignitaries, cultural leaders, and prominent citizens for an elegant gathering. The grand ballroom had been transformed with Canadian-themed decorations, featuring displays of local artwork and regional delicacies arranged on gleaming silver platters. Prince George entered the reception wearing his formal evening attire, looking every inch the young royal despite his tender age. However, those who had witnessed his earlier interactions with Prime Minister Trudeau watched him with heightened attention, wondering if his pattern of subtle challenges would continue in this more public setting. Trudeau had spent the time between events consulting with his staff about the unexpected turn the visit had taken. His advisors were divided in their assessment of Prince George's behavior. Some suggested the boy was simply well-educated and curious, while others worried that his questions reflected deeper criticism of government policies. "He's just a child," his chief of staff insisted. "Surely we're reading too much into innocent questions." But Trudeau wasn't convinced. His political instincts told him that Prince George's inquiries were too pointed and too well-informed to be coincidental. The young prince seemed to be making deliberate choices about when and how to express his concerns. The reception began with formal introductions, as various Canadian officials and dignitaries were presented to the royal family. Prince William and Princess Catherine moved through the receiving line with practiced ease, engaging in pleasant conversation with each guest. Princess Charlotte and Prince Louis, though growing tired from the day's activities, maintained their cheerful demeanor and charmed everyone they met. Prince George participated in the formal greetings with appropriate courtesy, but his responses remained notably brief and formal. When introduced to cabinet ministers, business leaders, and cultural figures, he acknowledged each introduction politely, but offered little additional conversation. The moment that would become the evening's most talked-about incident occurred when George was introduced to Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a prominent environmental scientist who had been critical of certain government policies. Unlike his reserved interactions with other guests, Prince George immediately showed genuine interest in meeting her. Dr. Mitchell, I've read some of your research on climate change impacts in the Arctic, George said, his voice carrying the first hint of enthusiasm anyone had heard from him all day. Your findings about permafrost degradation are quite concerning. Dr. Mitchell was surprised and impressed that a young royal would be familiar with her work. Thank you, Your Royal Highness. It's refreshing to meet someone your age who takes these issues seriously. Their conversation continued for several minutes, with George asking detailed questions about ocean warming, species migration, and the long-term consequences of current environmental trends. His questions demonstrated not just basic knowledge, but genuine understanding of complex scientific concepts. Trudeau, observing this interaction from across the room, felt increasingly uncomfortable. The contrast between Prince George's enthusiastic engagement with the environmental scientist and his cool reserve toward government officials was becoming impossible to ignore. When the Prime Minister approached to join the conversation, the change in George's demeanor was immediately apparent. Dr. Mitchell has been sharing some fascinating insights about Arctic research, George said to Trudeau, his tone returning to formal politeness. I'm sure you're familiar with her work on permafrost studies. The comment put Trudeau in an awkward position. While he was generally informed about environmental issues, he wasn't familiar with the specific details of Dr. Mitchell's research. His attempt to engage knowledgeably in the conversation only highlighted the gap between his broad political understanding and George's detailed knowledge. Environmental protection is certainly a priority for our government, Trudeau replied, falling back on general talking points. We're committed to meeting our international climate commitments while supporting economic growth. Prince George's response was swift and pointed. Dr. Mitchell's research suggests that current emission reduction targets may be insufficient to prevent significant environmental damage. How do you reconcile economic priorities with the urgency of climate action? The question was delivered in the same quiet, respectful tone that George had maintained throughout the visit, but its implications were significant. He was essentially challenging the Prime Minister's environmental policies in front of other guests, including a scientist whose research supported more aggressive action than the government was taking. Trudeau began to explain his government's approach to balancing environmental and economic concerns, but his response sounded increasingly like political rhetoric. Prince George listened politely, but without any sign of being convinced by the explanation. When Trudeau finished speaking, George simply nodded and said, "Thank you for sharing your perspective." The interaction left several guests uncomfortable, as they had witnessed a young royal effectively expressing skepticism about government policy in a public setting. Word of the exchange began to circulate quietly among the attendees, with varying interpretations of what they had witnessed. As the evening progressed, Prince George continued to engage enthusiastically with certain guests while maintaining his reserved demeanor with government officials. He had extended conversations with indigenous leaders, environmental advocates, and human rights activists, but showed little interest in speaking with politicians or business leaders who supported current government policies. The pattern was becoming unmistakable. Prince George was making conscious choices about who deserved his attention and engagement, and those choices reflected clear political preferences that were at odds with the official positions of Trudeau's government. During the formal dinner, seating arrangements placed Prince George at the head table with his family and senior Canadian officials. The conversation flowed easily among the adults, covering topics ranging from Canadian culture to Commonwealth relations. But whenever discussions touched on current political issues, Prince George's participation became notably minimal. When Trudeau spoke about Canada's role in international affairs and its commitment to multilateralism, Prince George listened without comment. When the Prime Minister discussed economic policies and trade relationships, the young prince focused on his meal rather than engaging with the conversation. However, when Elder Mary Sinclair, who had been invited to the dinner, spoke about Indigenous perspectives on current issues, Prince George gave her his full attention. He asked thoughtful follow-up questions and seemed genuinely interested in her insights about traditional knowledge and contemporary challenges. The contrast in his behavior was so pronounced that other guests began to take notice. Several Canadian officials exchanged glances, recognizing that something unusual was happening, but uncertain about how to interpret or respond to it. The situation reached a crisis point during the evening's formal toasts. Trudeau rose to offer a toast to the royal family, speaking eloquently about the strong relationship between Canada and the Commonwealth, the importance of shared values, and his government's commitment to building a better future for all Canadians. When it came time for Prince William to respond with a reciprocal toast, the moment everyone had been anticipating arrived. As his father spoke about the deep friendship between their nations and his family's appreciation for Canadian hospitality, Prince George sat quietly at the table, his hands folded in his lap. But when the time came to raise glasses in the traditional toast, Prince George remained seated. While everyone else in the room stood and raised their glasses to acknowledge the toast, the young prince simply sat still, his water glass remaining on the table untouched. The gesture was subtle enough that many guests didn't immediately notice what had happened. But those who were paying attention realized they had witnessed something unprecedented, a member of the royal family declining to participate in a formal diplomatic toast. The implications of this moment would extend far beyond the walls of Rideau Hall, as news of Prince George's behavior began to spread among the political and media circles who monitored such events. What had begun as a routine royal visit was evolving into something much more significant, with potential consequences that none of the participants could have anticipated. The morning after the reception brought urgent consultations in both royal and governmental circles. Prince William found himself in an unprecedented situation, trying to understand his eldest son's behavior while managing the diplomatic implications of what had occurred. Princess Catherine sat with George in their private quarters, attempting to discuss the previous evening's events. "George, darling, we need to talk about last night," she began gently. "Your father and I are concerned about your behavior during the formal dinner." Prince George looked up from the book he was reading about Canadian political history. His expression was serious, but not defensive. "I know my actions were unusual, Mother, but I couldn't participate in toasting policies that I believe are harmful to people and the environment." The maturity of his response was both impressive and troubling. Here was a 10-year-old child who had made a conscious political statement based on his own research and moral convictions. While his parents had always encouraged him to think independently, they hadn't anticipated that he would apply those principles in such a public diplomatic setting. "But, sweetheart," Catherine continued, "royal protocol requires us to maintain political neutrality. We represent the crown, not our personal political opinions." George considered this carefully before responding. "I understand the importance of neutrality, Mother. But doesn't the crown also have a responsibility to stand for justice and truth? Grandfather always taught me that leadership means doing what's right, even when it's difficult." Meanwhile, Prime Minister Trudeau was dealing with his own crisis management. News of Prince George's unusual behavior had begun to leak to media outlets, and political observers were speculating about the implications. His communications team, was scrambling to develop a response strategy that would minimize damage while avoiding any appearance of criticizing a child. "How do we handle this?" his press secretary asked during an emergency meeting. "We can't exactly attack a 10-year-old prince, but we also can't let the impression stand that he was justified in snubbing you." Trudeau ran his hands through his hair, clearly frustrated by the unprecedented situation. The boy is incredibly well-informed and obviously has strong convictions. I respect that, even if I disagree with his assessment of our policies. But this creates a diplomatic nightmare. The challenge was complicated by the fact that Prince George's criticisms weren't without merit. Canada did have ongoing issues with Indigenous rights, environmental protection, and other areas that the young prince had highlighted. His questions and concerns reflected real policy challenges that Trudeau's government struggled to address effectively. As word of the incident spread through political and media circles, various interpretations began to emerge. Some saw Prince George's behavior as inappropriate political activism by a child who didn't understand diplomatic protocols. Others viewed it as the refreshing honesty of a young person who wasn't constrained by political considerations. Environmental groups and Indigenous rights advocates quickly embraced Prince George as an unexpected ally. Social media posts praising his courage and knowledge began to circulate, with many people expressing admiration for a young royal who was willing to speak truth to power. Finally, someone in the royal family who isn't afraid to call out government hypocrisy, wrote one activist on Twitter. "Prince George shows more backbone at 10 than most politicians do in their entire careers." Conservative commentators had a very different reaction, criticizing the young prince for overstepping his role and potentially damaging important diplomatic relationships. They argued that royal children should be taught to observe rather than participate in political discussions. The international media quickly picked up the story, with headlines around the world highlighting the unusual spectacle of a young royal challenging a head of government. "Prince George's diplomatic snub shakes Canadian visit," read one major newspaper headline. Another proclaimed, "10-year-old prince stands up to prime minister over environmental policies." Back in their private quarters, the royal family was having their most serious conversation of the trip. Prince William had joined his wife and son, and the three of them were trying to navigate the complex situation that had developed. "George, I admire your convictions and your knowledge of these important issues," Prince William said carefully. "But your actions have created a diplomatic incident that could have serious consequences for our relationship with Canada." George looked thoughtful, but remained firm in his position. "Father, you taught me that being royal means serving others and standing up for what's right. How can I ignore what I've learned about suffering that could be prevented if leaders made different choices?" The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. A senior palace aide entered with urgent news that representatives from the Prime Minister's office were requesting a private meeting to discuss the situation. The meeting that followed was unlike any in recent diplomatic history. Prince William found himself in the unusual position of explaining his son's behavior to offended Canadian officials while trying to maintain the dignity of the crown and the integrity of the royal visit. "We deeply regret any offense that may have been caused by Prince George's actions," Prince William began diplomatically. He is, of course, still a child learning about protocol and appropriate behavior in formal settings. But Trudeau's chief of staff wasn't satisfied with this explanation. "Your Royal Highness, with respect, the prince's behavior seemed quite deliberate and well-informed. His questions weren't those of a confused child, but rather of someone who had researched our policies extensively and formed negative opinions about them." Prince William found himself in the impossible position of having to defend his son's right to hold informed opinions while acknowledging that expressing them publicly had violated diplomatic norms. Prince George is indeed well-educated about current affairs, perhaps too well-educated for his own good in this instance. The remaining events of the royal visit proceeded with noticeable tension. Official photos were taken and scheduled activities were completed, but The easy warmth that had characterized previous royal visits to Canada was notably absent. Prince George continued to maintain his polite but reserved demeanor with government officials while showing genuine enthusiasm for interactions with Indigenous leaders, environmental scientists, and social activists. The final official event was a farewell ceremony at the airport, where Trudeau made one last attempt to end the visit on a positive note. His remarks emphasized the strong relationship between Canada and the Commonwealth while carefully avoiding any reference to the controversies that had marked the trip. When it came time for final goodbyes, all eyes were on the interaction between Trudeau and Prince George. The young prince approached the Prime Minister with the same dignified composure he had maintained throughout the visit. Looking directly at Trudeau, he spoke clearly enough for nearby observers to hear. "Prime Minister, thank you for your hospitality during our visit. I hope that Canada's leaders will continue to listen to the voices of Indigenous peoples, environmental scientists, and others who are working for positive change." The statement was technically a polite farewell, but its content was unmistakably a final challenge to Trudeau's leadership on the issues that George cared about most. Trudeau managed a diplomatic response, thanking the prince for his interest in Canadian affairs and expressing hope that he would continue to follow Canada's progress on important issues. As the royal family boarded their aircraft for the journey home, the full implications of the visit were only beginning to be understood. Prince George had fundamentally changed the nature of royal diplomacy by demonstrating that even young members of the royal family could be informed, engaged, and willing to express their convictions publicly. The flight home was quiet, with each family member processing the events of the trip in their own way. Princess Charlotte and Prince Louis had enjoyed their Canadian adventure and were already asking about future travel opportunities. But Prince George remained thoughtful, clearly understanding that his actions had consequences beyond what he might have initially anticipated. "Do you regret what you did?" Princess Catherine asked her eldest son as they flew over the Atlantic. George considered the question carefully before responding. "I regret any diplomatic difficulties I may have caused, Mother. But I don't regret standing up for what I believe is right. I hope that someday I'll be able to use my position to help make positive changes in the world." The aftermath of the visit would continue to reverberate through political and royal circles for months to come. Prince George had established himself as a young person of strong convictions who wasn't afraid to express them, even in the most formal diplomatic settings. Whether this would prove to be a one-time incident or the beginning of a new form of royal engagement with political issues remained to be seen. But one thing was certain. The future King George VII would not be easily ignored or dismissed when he believed important principles were at stake.